DEENA METZGER, I think you all know, on my right. RUSHWORTH on my left. And CAROLYN BRIGIT FLYNN. So, it's wonderful to be together tonight, and I've been watching as people have been walking in, and I see many faces that are completely beloved to me. It's wonderful to see you here. And I see faces I've never seen before, and it's wonderful to see you here because you have been called in some way, or probably are beloved to Stan and DEENA. So when we do a night like this, our community comes together, and this sustains us. And it's amazing to come together on a night like this because literally the world is burning. So to have a night that's about climate change, that's about the earth and our future, and that is about our love of this planet and our own human future, as well as the future of all of the beings of this earth, it seems perfect timing. And to be, for me, just to be with these two amazing beings is an incredible honor. So it's a thrilling night for me. I just want to let you know a couple of brief things about how the evening is going to go. DEENA's going to do a little bit of a brief welcome, and then Stan is going to do an opening prayer for us. After that, we'll read in succession. I'll read first, then Stan, then DEENA. And we won't have an intermission, so the bathrooms are in the hallway. You know, if you need to get up, please feel free. After the reading, we will have a brief Q&A, which is why we have these chairs here, so there'll be some time for community conversation. And then book signing, more time to love each other up. So that will be our evening. And just a reminder about phones. Remember to turn them off. We are videotaping tonight, so we do want to be aware of those kinds of sounds. And no flash photography, please. And with that, I can happily, we'll do a more formal introduction a little bit later, but I'm going to welcome DEENA METZGER for an opening welcome. DEENA METZGER.
I wrote a poem about 40 years ago, and it's a poem that's familiar to many of you, I think. And today I realized that I had to rewrite it. And so there's one word is changed, and the word that's changed is slowly. So there are those who want to set fire to the world. We are in danger. There is time only to work wisely. There is no time not to love. So we're meeting as is right in such times. James Baldwin's prophetic words, "The fire next time," has been preceded by unprecedented hurricanes and floods. What times are we in? So it opens my heart to be here with my dear colleagues, fellow writers, friends who are truly kin. This is not an ordinary gathering. I've known Carolyn for about 30 years. When the young woman she was first showed up in my writing class in my home, she had a bad back and a story to tell. Whatever the physical cause of the back, it was exacerbated by carrying a story of prohibited relationship, such a story that breaks us to tell. Carolyn, almost unable to speak of it, referred to it simply as the Sheila story. But the telling of the story, as she now knows after many years of teaching, writing, and guiding the creative spirit, can open the way to marvels. Such a story opens and everything follows from that. There was a nascent, true writer in CAROLYN we couldn't know at the time. But now we know she is a wondrous writer, a courageous, wise woman, a dogged community builder and carrier of solitude, a profound and reliable guide. She is a wonder. Both her groundbreaking anthology, Sister Singing, Blessings, Prayers, Art, Songs, Poetry, and Sacred Stories by Women, and her book of luminous poems, Communion in Praise of the Sacred Earth, reveal her journey and alliance with Earth and the spirits. Her forthcoming book, from which you will read tonight, The Light of Ordinary Days, is aligned with the ancestors and the old ones of Ireland, with their great stone edifices that mark the entrances to the other world. CAROLYN's deep knowing of these ancient spirits confirm the realities so disdained and tortured in our times. It is this knowing and alliance that brings us together tonight as the world floods and burns. We hear the call like never before for those who will stand for the earth and for earth-based, spirit-based lives. Stan Rushworth. I received a message on Facebook, of all places, about 3 years ago from a man I didn't know. He said he'd been using a quotation of mine each year in a class at Cabrillo College and wanted to thank me for it by sending me his recent book. I was alarmed that I had to add another book to my reading. But I sent him my address. A few days later, I opened Going to Water, a journal of beginning rain. Within a few pages, I gasped. I knew by the first chapters that I was reading one of the great books of our time. Reading the book to its finish confirmed this recognition. Going to Water is a great American novel, a great Native American and great Indigenous novel. In his own words, he is devoted to the ideas, feelings, words that spring out of Indigenous experience, Native American experience, mixed blood experience, non-Indigenous experience, and the stories that rise up through all our histories together. He is currently working on the collection American Diaspora, stories of where post-traumatic stress disorder and post-colonial stress disorder dovetail, where Indigenous lives and colonial lives meet in Indigenous colonial descendants in the breeds spread far and wide across the world. It is a survival manual through story and a mirror of where we all are today. But for tonight, as we await American Diaspora, I want to emphasize this: Going to Water, from which he is going to read, is a great novel. By which I mean the rare literary occasion where Indigenous wisdom, contemporary intelligence, and vision, originality, profundity, story, character, range, heart, and determined truth-telling combine in one narrative and shake us to our roots, changing us accordingly. In this book, and in his earlier book of healing, Story and Prayer, Sam Wood's American Healing, Stan looks without flinching at our tragic current reality. His vision is critical to these times. On a lighter and more personal note, A Rain of Nightbirds would not be the book it is without the generous eyes of both CAROLYN and Stan, who read it again and again and again. This is a first but I doubt the last meeting of Carolyn and Stan, and so an important gathering of us all. Thank you all for being with us to bear witness to this time that calls us to do it together. Please welcome Stan Rushworth, who will offer the opening prayer, and his wife, Hydrin Hoffman, a dance and rhythm artist.
I haven't figured out how to pray in the machine yet. So, I guess I'm a diehard. Gio, welcome. Hello. My name is Stan Rushworth. I am Chalagi, Cherokee, Irish. My mother. DEENA just tore me up, you guys. I'm sorry. I feel like one of those Hawaiian guys, you know? They start to pray and you just weep because you're so grateful to be here, you know? That's what I feel like. So, our way is my mother's family is Cherokee, my father's is English, my mother's is Cherokee and Irish through Vivian Sherman, my mother, the Stanley family, Sam Stanley and Sally Stewart. And we go way back here. That side, my mother's side of my family, thousands of years. So that's who I am. And before I pray, I want to acknowledge that we're on a land that was called Whippy for thousands of years. Thousands. You should just kind of roll that number around in your mouth a little bit. Thousands of years. This, where we are, is called Whippy. Okay? And it's been a colonial land for a very, very brief time. About this big. If you do the timeline, right? And you look at how long it's been Santa Cruz, it's about that big. So, in acknowledging the people who came before, the Whippy people here, I want to tell you, just to think about this image, I want to tell you about the words of a Spanish soldier, one of the first people to land here in Whippy, who said, California, and this is a direct quote, was like a vast, well-tended garden. That same soldier wrote that there were so many pelicans that the flocks would block out the sun. Okay? He tells of a soldier, a fellow soldier, who killed a pelican, and all the other pelicans attacked the soldier, and the local Whippy people had to fight the pelicans away to save the soldier's life. So when you think about it today, and you go out and you see 20 or 30 pelicans, and you feel grateful to see that many of those beautiful birds, I want you to think about 150 years ago, which is a blink of an eye, you know, that they would block out the sun. And how that's happened. And in that, remembering, we need to honor those people, the Whippy people. We need to honor the Mutsun people, the Rumsian people, people they call the Salinan. And before I ask for a blessing, I want to acknowledge those people, then and now. Okay? I want to acknowledge the thousands of people in our community that we call Ohlone, lumping them all into that. The thousands who are living here now, and we be keeping that dream of reality alive. Okay? All over the Bay Area, they're asking that this society, that this world now, honor their sacred sites. They're asking that. So when they ask that, please listen. Please do what you can. Please acknowledge that those people are still here and they're still fighting, and that there is a war going on for their survival, which is everybody's survival. So please acknowledge that. I'm going to ask for a blessing in 3 languages. English, which you'll all know. Salage, which is the Cherokee word for our language. And Nde, which is Chiricahua Apache. I'm going to kind of translate as I go along, but not really. So you just kind of have to guess which language is what. I do this because I grew up in the schools, like all of you, speaking English. My heritage is Cherokee. It goes way, way back in my life, from childhood, from infancy, really. And I use the Nde, or Chiricahua Apache language, by adoption. So I use all 3 languages, just so you know.
Thank you, Sam and Hydron. And please welcome CAROLYN, BRIGIT, FLYNN, reading from The Light of Ordinary Days.
Thank you, DEENA. Thank you, Stan and Hydran. So the spirits are here. They have been called in. It's interesting to be joining this evening. As DEENA mentioned, I found her so young, and we have been together for 30 years now. And there was a point when I said to DEENA, and it seemed like a far dream, I said, you know, I've got to go back to Ireland, because like so many of us in America, I felt that sense of placelessness and a lack of lineage growing up in the United States. I knew there was some Irish ancestry, but didn't know that much about it. I had gone to Ireland as a child with my family, but hadn't been back as an adult on my own. And I remember saying this to DEENA, and she said, well, you'll just have to go. And this seems obvious, you buy a plane ticket and you go. But at the point she said this to me, it was like someone said, sure, you can go to Mars. You just go get the plane ticket and go. For whatever reason, the barrier seems so large. I can just say DEENA has done that for many, many people on the planet, right? Said that one thing, yes, you can go wherever. So my family ancestors are from Ireland, and as an adult, after that first time, I began to go to Ireland on my own. And when I first started, I wanted to find my own ancestors. I wanted to find my cousins in Ireland and my family line. And I did. I found my living family. I found much about my own family ancestors, but what I wasn't really expecting was to fall entirely in love with the Irish landscape, particularly the sacred landscape of Ireland, the old standing stones, 5,000 years old, the rivers and the lakes, the land of Ireland, the checkerboard green. I fell in love with the land and came to understand that the stones were my ancestors and the land itself was my ancestor. So that long lineage goes back a very long time, obviously, and I found the FLYNN clan goes back, you know, my father's clan goes back in Ireland, can be traced 2,000 years to, you know, a very, very indigenous people there in Ireland. So it is an amazing story to find my way back there. After 20 years of traveling very regularly to Ireland, I spent the last 4 years writing a book about it, and it's part memoir, part travel story, and part a history of the sacred places of Ireland. So it's called, as DEENA mentioned, The Light of Ordinary Days. And I'm going to be reading to you from a section where I'm just about embarking on that first journey. When I had first said to DEENA, I need to go, and I went for 2 months. In 1996, I was 38 years old. This is chapter 12, it's called Cottage. In the movie version of this story, the camera opens with a wide aerial view of Bear Island, a small, lush green island off the southwest coast of Ireland. The day is fine, the ocean a bright slate blue. The camera pans above green checkerboard fields, then sweeps above a tiny local village of about a dozen buildings, and then moves on to the middle of the island, sweeping above a lone standing stone in an open field. Then guitar strands begin, with Van Morrison's classic rock song, Into the Mystic. Right? You can hear it. Yes. The camera moves on to the southern edge of the island with massive granite cliffs, wild, gorgeous, uninhabitable. And far below, looking like small ants, a man walks with a herd of sheep in steep green hills. A seagull swoops by. At the far edge of the island, the camera pans down to a stone cottage set above the cliffs, made of beautiful gray stone, a modern glass door, and a clean new roof. Then the camera switches to a noisy scene at a harbor. 2 Irishmen direct a woman with short dark hair and pale skin as she backs her rental car over the metal plank of a ferry. Van Morrison now begins singing, "We were born before the wind, also younger than the sun." The woman sticks her head out the window, looking to the men for direction as she lets out her clutch and lurches backward over the plank. "Ah, you're doing fine," calls the bearded Irishman. "Well, not quite," cries another one. "Jesus, will you watch it? A sharp turn now. Okay, there, you're all right." The woman sits for a moment in the car, her breath a bit quick. Then she gets out and stands in the wind, her eyes toward the green island a few miles across the ocean. 3 more cars back expertly onto the ferry in a flash. The plank is drawn up, ropes are pulled, the ferry begins to move. Van Morrison sings on, "Hark now hear the sailors cry. Smell the sea and feel the sky. Let your soul and spirit fly into the mystic." In real life, it was me backing awkwardly onto the ferry and me standing on the deck holding onto the rail as we crossed green-gray choppy seas. I put my hand on my chest, an instinctive move to ease my pounding heart. It was a family trait. In that moment, I might have been my Aunt May, born in County Galway, Ireland in 1908, who lived out her life in Leominster, Massachusetts. Across the water, Bear Island slowly grew before my eyes. It was unreasonably beautiful, a sparkling green jewel. In half an hour, I was driving off the ferry, easy now that I faced forward, and onto the grassy, wet island. There was no soundtrack, but there might have been. I was 38 years old and had embarked upon the defining quest of my life. In my body, there was a rightness as to time and place. I followed directions to a house where I would fetch keys to the cottage I'd rented. From there, a young dark-haired beauty named Catherine, cousin of the owner of the cottage, led me to the far side of the island, to a renovated stone place known as Jim's Place. Pictures of Jim, an old Irish bachelor who had died a decade before, were set up on an oak bureau inside, along with a few pictures of his parents and siblings. Catherine showed me how to work the heat and the water heater and began a fire in the large stone fireplace. When I was alone, I walked through the cottage marveling. The stone walls and fireplace of the original cottage had been retained, and 2 new rooms had been added to the back and side of the house. Jim's Place, probably 150 years old, was now light-filled and open. The opposite of the stone cottages I saw when I first came to Ireland at 14 years old in 1972. Traditional Irish cottages are generally dark inside, the windows very small so as to not destabilize the structure. The stones are put together without mortar. Usually they're stone or whitewashed mud, depending upon the environs. But this cottage had been opened up. The interior was finished with white walls, and 2 skylights and a glass door poured light into the rooms. I admired the tasteful, simple art on the walls. I could hardly believe my good luck. Through an unlikely set of circumstances, this cottage had become available to me on a remote island off the southwest coast at an affordable price. This would be my home for the next month, to rest and read, to write, and ponder my recent visits with cousins in County Galway and Roscommon, and to encounter the spirits of my ancestors, if such a thing was possible. It was August, a warm evening. Though I would experience all manner of weather during my stay, that first night was balmy. I sat outside in the long, bright summer air and even felt the need to put on sunscreen. I gazed out at the sea. The vista was startling to my soul, so beautiful as to be almost wounding, wide, open, and deep. I had glimpsed the island's massive cliffs as I drove to the cottage. The sea was loud and wild. Beside me were a few books of poetry, and my journal was open. But all I could do was sit and stare. I put up my feet and closed my eyes. This was going to be great. I wrote for a bit in my journal, and then, out of the blue, it hit me how utterly alone I was a woman by myself. Who knew who lived on this island? Had word gotten out that I was there by myself? Scenes from violent movies, all the awful things done to women flashed through my mind. No one would know if anything happened to me. No one expected to hear from me for several weeks. I looked out at the sea and felt the great edge to which I had come. What was I thinking? I saw myself, a small defenseless woman before the great expanse of the unknown. I walked back inside, pulled on pajamas, and crawled into a little twin bed in the back room. I heard noises on the road and jumped. I wrapped 2 blankets tight around me, feeling more vulnerable and alone as darkness descended. Maybe I would have to leave tomorrow. This was a little crazy. Just now there was nothing to do but hunker down and get through the night. I would figure it all out in the morning. 4 dreams decided the issue. In the first dream, I awake in the cottage, alone and frightened. I hear noises in the living room and realize that someone has broken in. I screw up my courage and walk out into the front room. I move to turn on the light, but the lamp doesn't work. I try to shout, but in a familiar dream moment, only a squeak comes from my mouth. Then I hear a noise out back. I go to the side door and see that a car is parked in the road behind the cottage. Its bright headlights beam past the house all the way down to the sea. There in the light, a group of matronly women in Sunday dresses, rather like Aunt Bee of the 1950s television series Andy of Mayberry, frolic in the waves. They pull off their shoes and run in the surf, kicking up the water and laughing. I woke with a start. It had been so real. It took a moment to comprehend that no one was in the cottage. No car was parked behind me. No women were dancing in the ocean. I scribbled down the dream. My heart was slowly calming from dank fear and adrenaline from the early part of the dream. But the ending, it fell into the category of just plain crazy cool. In the second dream, I wake again with a start, feeling yet again afraid and alone. In the dark, I sense other presences and realize that a small cat sleeps in the bed with me. Another cat is curled across the room. A dog is rounded on the floor by the bed. They must be the animals of the house, I think. They want company. The dog sleeps peacefully. I realize that he would bark if there was danger. In the dream, I drift easily back to sleep. In the third dream, a thinning old man walks me around the cottage. He shows me how certain doors and windows work, points out art on the walls, and orients me to the place. In the dream, I think it's probably old Jim, the bachelor Irishman of the cottage. Then in the fourth dream, the wife of the couple who renovated the cottage shows me around. She knows pieces of art that she has put up, where she stores candles and other things that make the place beautiful. She wants to make sure I am aware of them, that I realize their beauty, and will take care of them. I woke and opened my journal to write the dreams down. I could still sense the comfort of the animals, and though I knew they weren't there, found myself glancing around for them. I walked through the house. The morning was an Irish morning, not much sun, but daylight had returned. The quiet cottage was just itself. I reasoned that serial killers would probably not choose a tiny island where they couldn't fade into the crowd. And there was no way to get away except on a ferry that didn't leave until the next morning. I remembered talks with the owners of the cottage about the friendly neighbors across the road who were familiar with Jim's place and would be willing to take me on a walk up into the hills. I looked around the little place. It was rather a mess. I'd hardly put away the groceries, and what little I had unpacked from suitcases before curling up in bed was scattered about. I ate a breakfast of toast, apples, and Irish tea, and set about making the house right. I've had thousands of dreams in my life. They've scared me, bored me, made me scratch my head, made me happy. I've had nightmares I couldn't shake for days. Dreams that hovered above, tantalizingly out of reach. Dreams that left me out of sorts. Dreams that were luminous, like the time I realized I could fly and soared above the neighborhood. I have seen extraordinary dream work done by Jungians, African healers, and Native American medicine people. But in all that time, and in the 20 years since those days on Bear Island, these 4 dreams strike me as the most direct and generous of any I've ever had. What poured down to me that night was the purest of welcomes. What are dreams? I have studied and worked with them for much of my life, but what they are remains a luminous mystery. I asked this question once of a North American shaman, this person who often received mythic dreams and could dream on behalf of others. She had a fluid, thoughtful, and daily relationship with the dream world. But in answer to my question, she said she did not know. She knew how to work with dreams, she knew how to live by them, but she didn't know what they were. My wife, Jean, is a frequent and deep dreamer, and this part of her life connects her with her poet's soul. To her, it's obvious that the earth and the growing world before our eyes is sacred, but that there are other worlds, which are part of this one or close by, that our lives can be lifted up by something invisible. That is made clear to her by the fact of dreams. If I had been wondering about whether we can be lifted up by something invisible, as I made myself small and little in the back room that first night, feeling the dark expanse of the world and every bad thing humans do within it, I was no longer wondering about this upon waking in the morning. I was clear-headed and calm as I set about my first day. In part, I had unwittingly been given the heebie-jeebies by my sister Mary just before I left. I was telling her about my upcoming journey to Ireland, including my plan to stay alone on a little Irish island for a month. Like others, she had concerns for my safety, staying alone on a small island that none of us had heard of before. Then she said to me, "Are you afraid of fairies?" "Well, no," I responded. "Why would I?" Years before, my lovely sister had surprised the family by marrying a Palestinian Muslim and then converting to Islam. She had a wide and beautiful faith that clearly sustained her. She prayed 5 times a day, bowed down with her whole body. When in public, she wore a veil. She was still one of the funniest people I knew, one of the deepest and smartest. She was still my sister. But I did not imagine that fairies had much currency in her Muslim worldview. I learned that night, in fact, that Muslims do believe in fairies, known as jinn. The jinn not only exist in folklore, but are described in the Quran. The tradition differentiates between angels of the celestial realms, humans who are earthy and made of clay, and the jinn, said to be created from fire. The jinn, Mary told me, came in all forms. Some were beautiful, helpful, and friendly. Some were jealous of humans, and sometimes caused havoc or even harm. So just be careful, she said. They favor lonely places and the sea. Well, I didn't know what to say. Maybe until then I had even sort of hoped I would come upon a fairy or two in Ireland, as in I wanted to really meet the traditions of the place. Many Irish country tales tell of people taken by fairies to a magical place where they are happy for a long time, maybe 100 years or more, until they begin to miss human life and want desperately to return. But these stories were from a long time ago. I was surprised to learn that my devout sister absolutely believed in small creatures who lived in the hills and the deserted places of the earth. Creatures who were not visible to humans, but who could see us, take human form, and mess with us and our stuff. Sometimes they stole things, Mary mentioned. Now I was sort of chuckling. Really, sister? Like the little green men or the leprechauns our mother liked to blame for the disappearance of our belts, shoes, school papers, and the sweater she could never find? Our mother had been told about the little green men by her father, who had heard of them from his Irish mother, Kate Ryan Carey. The fairies made their way down to us, little green men scrambling about our 1950s house in America, and they were mostly harmless pranksters. I pictured them down in the basement in some invisible closet, hoarding loads of our stuff. But they didn't trip us or harm us or occupy our bodies or take us away for 100 years. Well, no, I told my sister, I'm not afraid of the fairies. I don't really think they want to harm us. That belief might protect you, she said sagely. Jotting down the dreams that morning, I could feel that a small grace had come. My sister was right. There were jinn in the uninhabited hills and wild places. Fairies, known as the She in Irish, or sometimes simply called the good people in country Ireland. I'd been incredibly lucky that the spirits of this place were so welcoming. Now I walked outside the cottage and looked to the sea. I'd come to Bear Island with the hope of connecting with my family ancestors, yet those who had come to greet me were the local spirits of the cottage itself. I had no ancestry from that island, no previous connections there at all. A small part of me thought, who are you? I've come for my own people. But the actual world always insists itself. The land, the material world of stones, houses, trees, and rivers have their own spirit and have imbibed the people and histories around them. This is what the Irish tales tell us, that spirit can and does inhabit places. Fairies are totally present in modern Ireland. They are said to be specific to a certain tree, or a bend in the river, or standing stone circles, or a fairy ring. They attach to land and place. The fact that in my dreams, old Jim, who had lived so long in the cottage, wanted to show me around, that the current owner showed me the beauty she had created, that the spirits of the animals of the cottage had come. Well, it all made a kind of quiet sense. It was physical, local, and strangely ordinary in an otherworldly kind of way. Thank you. So there's a touch of Ireland. And now I'm very happy to welcome up Stan Rushworth.
I'm a little shaky, don't mind that. It's the agent inside of me, that being Agent Orange. Thank you for your service. It keeps happening and happening, you know, it keeps coming back. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Right? You gotta have a sense of humor. Okay. So, I'm gonna read 2 chapters and a few words. This book comes out of I say what I knew as an infant and a child, and also what I was taught by my grandfather, because my mother gave me to him when I was 5, and she said, our way of life is in danger of dying, so you raise this kid so it doesn't die. Well, you know, that's a heck of a thing to put on a kid, right? Yeah. So what it is, I hesitate to call it an idea because it's not an idea. And I hesitate to call it a vision because it's not that either. It's a knowing, I suppose, that all of human existence includes, is the right word, all of space and all of time. So, Carolyn, you're talking about the dream. So in that sense, all of what we're living is the human dream. And everything that happens in that dream, in any place, at any time, affects every other moment in time and space. And the separations that we're acculturated into are very arbitrary. And they have a tendency to keep us from being accountable for our actions. And I think we can see where we are today in terms of climate change and everything else. A very definite result of this lack of accountability. So, this book is written from, it's a journal, the journal Beginning Rain. Beginning Rain is the woman's name who is writing the journal. Agana is the Tsalagi word for beginning rain. I like the sound of it. Agana, right? Agazga is fully falling rain. Agana is just the beginning, right? And she's confronted by a 6-year-old girl in the town next to her who's never spoken, who periodically goes into states of what we now call depression or catatonia, where she comes very near death. None of the healers can figure out why this is happening. So they call Agana, because Little Rain, the little girl, has such a similar name. And they think maybe there's a connection. So Agana goes in to the girl's dream. And in her dream, she sees manifest destiny. She sees, and this is 1,000 years before contact. This is 1,000 years. She comes from 1,000 years before Columbus, okay? And in this little girl's dream, she sees George Armstrong Custer. She sees, you all know who that is, right? Right? The general. She sees Dachau. She sees the Mayan kings, the impulse to empire, okay, that takes over in so many places in the world. She sees the massacre at Sand Creek in the 1860s. Right? She sees a lot of things. She sees Nagasaki, okay, in this little girl's dream 1,000 years before contact. And she decides, she sees that what this is doing in the Cherokee culture, this is called crossing the children's fire. And it's the greatest, quote, sin. That you do things, you create a world that destroys children's belief in life. You know? And so these perpetrators are constricting the human imagination and making us believe the ultimate lie, which is that human nature is fallen, that human nature is bad. We believe that, we fall to authoritative structures that then tell us how to be, because we no longer take responsibility for our own lives. Okay? So she decides, sits with her grandmother and says, we've got to at least, we cannot change history, but we've got to at least meet with these perpetrators at the moment of their death and give them the opportunity to see what they've done, because that then opens the door in the human imagination. So the first chapter I'm going to read is Agana's meeting with George Armstrong Custer at Little Bighorn. And the reason I'm reading this is because this is the chapter that my big sister here read. She's my big sister. She's my older sister, DEENA, okay? And I didn't know that till 3 years ago, even though I've been using her poem for 30 years at Cabrillo, right? But she read this chapter and it grabbed her, so I'm going to read this. And honor of her. My name is Agana, beginning rain. And no one knows when I was born. That's because I'm like the cloud people, the Zapotec, who evolved from nowhere. We have always existed, and when conditions were right, we came into being. The truth is, I've been around a long time, and I'm no one to mess with. I am a tall, strong, smart woman, and on good days, fearless enough to get the job done. I will match wits with anyone, and I can back it up. I can back up the tongue they say is smart with fists, feet, knives, or guns. I can slice someone apart with a gaze or bring a person down onto the soft earth in peace and gentleness, whatever needs to happen. Someone called me beautiful the other day, and it surprised me because I don't often think of human things that way, although stars are undoubtedly beautiful, and the sunrise and each precious breath. But when I bent to wash my hair later that day, I gazed into the still pond anyway, and my open black hair hung its tips into the cool water as I kneeled over the surface, and the eyes that sparkled back up at me had a brief moment of looking like stars. So I thought about what that woman said and took its meaning into consideration. Beauty is a powerful thing in this world, after all. It can hide people, keep others from seeing what's beneath, intentions, darkness lying in there ready to pounce. It seduces too, promising thing, drawing another person or being into a sphere of influence, like the flash of a lure to a hungry trout. Like Custer, they say he was beautiful too, but me, I only remember the crimson of his blood and the blood of those he touched, like a scythe he was across our lands. Because of that memory, I had to go there, you see, just before he died. I stepped between all those steel-tipped arrows and dying creatures to where he lay died. Close-cropped golden hair matted with sweat and horse blood and human blood and fear. Everything was getting quiet like it does after a battle. The surreal quiet and drone of death stepping away in the mind, from the mind. The warriors' hands were shaking, quivering as the fighting power fell from them. All of it over now. Another reality slipping into place. The kind of knowing that each warrior will learn to live with, learn to carry, whether it's in his nightmares, dreams of glory, or knowledge of being part of a history that will last forever. It's in the smell of urine and blood, in his fear, in his having won the battle, in the strength he lets slide off as another way of living enters him and changes him forever. The warriors saw me approach Custer, and they backed away. My flint knife was not for killing, and they could see its medicine, centuries old. One man dropped to his knees, placed his palm on the earth, and sang softly, watching, helping us all. A pale blue mist rose from the ground, and silence encompassed the general and me. He was afraid when he saw the knife, fear peeling his eyes back so the whites shone brightly up at me. "You're safe," I said. "Soon to be dead, but safe, and you will not die at my hand." He took a breath. The fear did not leave his eyes, but it wasn't of me anymore. It was of himself, of what he would see of his life in the next moments, meeting his own heaven and hell, because this was the world he knew and made for himself and everyone else. Heaven and hell, that simple scourge brought into our land. I saw his journey flit across his eyes. Then I let 4 small drops of dark liquid from my pouch fall into his mouth and slung it back across my chest. I want you to live a little longer so you have time to think. You must look at all the killing you have done, at the way you have seen us, at the cowardice you displayed in killing so many innocents. He stared at me, wanting to be hard, but he could not. Now your arrogance has finally killed you and your men, and your terrorizing my people is finished, and you have to listen. He tried to speak, but his voice was cut short by the approach of 3 Cheyenne and Hunkpapa fighters. I looked at them quickly, and they stopped a respectful distance away. They had never seen me before, but they knew me, knew who I was. Our people are like that. They could see what I was doing, so they watched, standing very still. The warrior with his palm on the ground continued singing very softly into the earth. Do you see it now? I asked. But Custer stared straight ahead, refusing in his stubbornness, though he was no longer afraid of the men. I reached down and sliced a small tuft of his hair with the flint knife. Gold, I thought. That's what it's all about. Custer leading the geologist into Dakota territory despite government promises. As usual, the promise falling prey to the need of those who break it. Predation justified by need. I held the hair in front of Custer's eyes. Here's your gold, I said. Not to be cruel, but to be real with him. No pity, no mercy. I led his eyes to the ground, and he followed my hand forward and downward until my fingers touched the earth, and I put the hair in the ground. I scooped a small hole in the soil and covered it, and Custer's eyes stayed on the tiny, dark mound. Maybe earth will take you back to truth now, I said, very softly, for I wanted him to listen to his own voices. We all listened, the warriors and me and Custer, and the sky began to change around us all. Dreadful dark, then light, light, then dreadful dark, moving above the softly circling blue mist. It is up to you now. This is your chance. So don't be as stupid in your dying as you have been in your life. Take your chance. Custer stared and breathed, and his eye turned to the darkening purple sky, then back to the damp earth, while the herbs opened his heart to his mind, and he breathed on. The warriors watched, asking themselves if this man deserved the chance he was getting to see himself, maybe to make amends as he died. But they knew enough of life and death to know that this was not their decision. Each of them had fallen to the cruelty that had too long spread across their vast holy prairies, a plague. And each had to make their own amends in whatever way they could. Few were spared the corruption within this great change come upon them. For them to deny this fighter, this man, this scourge, this hero of the enemy, his own moment in the growing darkness would be to deny themselves the same possibility. Then Custer looked directly at me, where I remained kneeling above him, and his eyes finally fell open. There were no tears, but there was a moment of their glazing over when I knew he was seeing his wife's eyes and mine. And I let this happen with a rueful smile, tender and hard at once, for I would never be fooled by such things. And though he was cruel and deranged, it may be that he loved too. I have been seen as many things, beautiful and kind and cruel and ugly, and as long as that vision serves earth, I will let it be. I know any vision changes when I don't hold to it, and change it did quickly, and then I became all those Indian women who fell under his sword, and his eyes stayed on mine, straight into me, unflinching, widening, his soul breaking open, and I stared back into him. It did not take long, for the medicine is quick in its purpose, and he was a child beneath me, lying against the contorted limbs of his dead comrades. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, struggling for an answer, trying to move, but he could not. "It has nothing to do with you," I said. "This seeing is just what is possible for us all. And you are at the center of something horrible and large and strange at this moment. And it must be done like this for everyone." And then he turned and died, looking down at earth, a strange smile pulling at the corners of his mouth, not a satisfied smile, but something of otherworldly irony and sadness. I stood slowly and walked down the hill to vanish among the people and the electric purple night. The warriors knew not to touch him, not to cut him, but to leave him lying where he was. It was done now, and the white newspapers would say the worst about our mutilations, no matter what was done or not done, no matter what soldiers who knew better might see in the following days as the populace was lost in their craziness and lust for war and gold at this point. What happened that day was a powerful center of a huge churning movement in history, a beginning to what would follow for the next 100 years. And what we accomplished together held a secret that would perhaps only fully come to fruit in still another 100 years. Who knows? Maybe what we accomplished that day helped to prevent even more ravages than history has held before our dismayed eyes. In this long war, but that's what it is. Might call it a war for the soul. I don't use that word very often, but one needs allies. So this is a woman now. Winona Duke is her name. She's an Anishinaabe, a wonderful woman. She's an activist now. Some of you may know who she is. She's a small woman in stature, this young Anishinaabe fighter, but huge in spirit. She stands one day at the edge of her people's lake, a blue lake that owns the people rather than the other way around, watching with a smile that rises from the bottom of her belly as the rice harvesters paddle out in their canoes into the tall, full rice plants. On another day, she stands erect and intense, yet relaxed in her firm conviction before a polished old courtroom, before a judge who does not understand how a lake can own a people. It may be that, as a wrinkled and tired old man, he might come to it at this point in his life, where he has seen so much senseless but logical laws. But the tradition of law he obeys does not see it. And he must return to that legacy to call up his decision and his position, the rigid position of his culture. It's strange that his culture does not even define itself as a culture, except for in its music, popular music and blues and jazz. These are the famous signatures, but law and property, decidedly cultural positions, are defined only as what's right, ontological even, given, evolved, and evolving from a moral base that is assumed and never defined, but for in position after position, the posture that too often gives those who wield the gavel just what they want. Again, I am struck by the strangeness of it. but no longer surprised. And this small, beautiful woman standing square-shouldered in front of it all, in front of the centuries of it all, fills me with pride and gratitude. When the harvesters return, the smell of the rice fills the air, and there are tired smiles and celebrations. They are not rich, these people, but they have survived, and they continue to survive, for through their very strength of spirit, they have convinced the law the rice is theirs for almost 200 years in trade for almost all of their land. They have found enough like-minded old white men to form a trail of precedent that holds precarious sway from 1837 to the first decades of the 21st century. They climb into old Ford pickups and make their ways home, a man driving with one hand and caressing his wife's knee with the other, glancing to her as they remember all the years of poling through the shallows, carefully threshing the grains from the plants overhanging the canoe bottom. They recall not only their own years, but the years of all those before them. Reflections of long walks home, carrying handmade baskets, shine off the truck's dusty windshield, and they smile, the same smile the young woman does from deep within where their lives began. In the courtroom, young, finely dressed white lawyers who are not owned by a leg, but by pages in a book and their own deep desires, tell how their clients can grow wild rice. Thanks. Tell how their clients can grow wild rice in paddies in California and market it as wild rice, even though no indigenous people grow or harvest it. It's a term, they argued to the old judge, owned by no one in particular, wild. Their clients took precious kernels from the Anishinaabe lake and put them in their test tubes, petri dishes, and centrifuges, and planted their grim-faced engineers in the genetic stream of forever, and then engineers spun round and round like kids in a tilt-a-whirl at a cheap carnival and came out smiling with wild rice in their hands. And then they named it and sold it in plastic bags with pictures of Indian canoes, two people, a couple to a canoe, paddling softly into the lakes. The Anishinaabe woman, and many alongside her and before her, said no. And the smiles fled the engineers and accountants and artists' faces, and everybody went to the big stone courthouse to decide between right and wrong, simply because there is no shame in those who think they own the land and the lake and the sky. I stood beside her one evening as the boats came back, as she watched her teenage son empty their own canoe of the rich, nutty brown and tan harvest. I had been looking at for her because I had to feel her strength, woman to woman. I hoped it would not be a one-way thing between us, me taking from her out of my own need during this very hard time in this part of the world. This is good, I said, that you are fighting. For me, 200 years was both very long and very short, the time it takes to take a breath, to glance from here to there. She looked up at me in silence before she spoke, a calm expression on her face. She nodded toward her son, who worked silently without his cell phone or iPod, listening to the others working and laughing, and to the sound of grain on old wood swishing into evening. Tiny flying insects of many kinds rode paling light. She nodded. We've been fighting this fight for a very long time, she said. Centuries. Later, as we sat at the lake's edge, looking across it and back to each other, she told me that most of the world's diverse life forms, plants and animals, live on land inhabited by indigenous people, some 90%. She told me in her fact-filled, strong, and gentle voice while the sun dropped lower that food corporations and medicine corporations were going into these lands with lawyers and scientists to form patents, the rights to own knowledge exclusively, knowledge indigenous people have held and shared for thousands of years. She said indigenous people were banding together now and that they must continue to band together to fight this intrusion because as the scientists twist the inheritance, the lifeblood of the plants, they play with things impossible to know. Simple things like where an adventuresome blue-necked duck might fly with a sterile pollen. A completely twisted concept of contradiction for how and why might pollen be sterile and have no power. They toy with more complex things too, like where wind might carry something they've made that is mechanical and deeply internal and mysterious, a tiny grinding steel thing like the tilt-a-whirl, a shiny steel face of one grinning particle of pollen, one crazy particle tossed into a world that has been established forever by simple respect and admiration and sunlight and rain. What might happen in this meeting? She told me all of this and more for hours as though spilling so much of what she knew of time and science was casting it out into the world for all people to hear and know, out through a horn of plenty. I was a vehicle to her, though she did not know me. And as she talked and night came on gently with the lake lapping at the shore only feet from where we sat, I thought of where knowledge comes from, how it takes form, finds a voice, then flies like pollen from plant to plant, mind to mind, imagination to action. And I felt good, even redeemed by so much of what she brought to the world out of her own simple desire to live the way she had to. I thought that all of her knowledge and caring could only return to both of us. It could never have been one way between us, not with this woman. And when she finally went on her way with a departing nod and a warm smile, I knew how deeply she was an ally, not only of mine, but of everyone. In this, there is great comfort and more. There is possibility. Thank you. Thank you very much.
She was saying, go ahead. She was saying, well,
What?
go ahead. She was saying, go ahead. More.
Didn't know what that meant. Whether it was like that. She promised me earlier a hook. This is very short. One of the other allies in here is Will Rogers. You all know who he was? From Cherokee, the satirist, social satirist, humorist. Will Rogers was a social satirist and humorist of the 1920s and 1930s. He was a confidant of many U.S. presidents. He's famous for going to see Mussolini at the time that fascism was rising in Italy. And Mussolini said to him, because he was as famous as Ali during Ali's high years, right, worldwide. And Mussolini said to him, he said, well, I'm very impressed that you came all this way to see me. And Will Rogers said, well, I just wanted to see what kind of a bird you was. So Will Rogers was a hero in my family. Will Rogers was a hero in my family, and so he's an ally to Agana throughout. And here, Agana is so beset by all the stuff going on in the world, she wants to forget. She wants to forget it, you know. She wants to do what, you know, people say, well, you know, just like let it go.
Yeah, right.
You know, it's like, where's it gonna go? Right? We're living on this little thing that's about that big, right? you know, circling the world, where's it? Let it go. Sorry, it just boggles my mind. To where? The trash bin. We're living in the trash bin, you know. Okay, so she's depressed. She's having a hard time, so she goes to Will. And he tells her, you know, you can't forget. You see, he said, the Trail of Tears wasn't even a century ago, and our people are still scattering all over this land. You know that. It's still scattering today in 1920 because the Indian Territory is a tough place to call home, and it's not our home. Out in California, they just put the last Yahi, they call him, a fellow named Ishi, to rest after he showed those folks out there what his life was like for 40 years of hiding from them very same folk. Had him in a museum in Berkeley, they did. That was only yesterday, about the time my young son was born. I can't forget that, my son being born. You don't forget something like that. And things are attached to that kind of birth. Things we see in the papers and things people talk about, they're stuck to them, and there's no getting away from it. He gathered more words in quiet, looking up at the moonlight on the oaks. A white owl cut an arc across the north end of our clearing in the place of wisdom and swept out over the hills to hunt in silence. The way I see it is that if I forget, I limit my mind, you know. I shrink it down into what I might think for a moment would get me by. But it turns out it's not enough then. I got to remember. I just got to, because it's all there. It's all there for the remembering. Now, most folks around here don't want to, and that's to their loss, if you know what I mean. There's a limit. That's a limit to their minds. And when you limit your mind, you shrink your heart. And I never want to tie my heart down or to shrink it in any way. There's too much going on, too much out in the world to get touched by and to touch. It's all just too big, you know. And if you shrink your heart, why, you shrink everything there is in this world. Don't forget that, Will said. And he meant all that he'd been talking about, and the owl's flight too. And he nodded toward it as it vanished toward the sea. Don't forget anything, and hold it gently inside of you, because it's all still moving. It's all still moving. And when you remember everything, you get a say in where it goes. Thank you.
Was that incredible? Was that incredible? Thank you so much, Jan. I'm a little speechless. Thank you. So we have a moment now to welcome our guest of honor to Santa Cruz, DEENA METZGER. We are here because we're gathered to celebrate A Reign of Nightbirds, her new novel. And, you know, she could have easily just come and done a reading by herself, but all of this, all of her life, and particularly her life right now, is about alliances. And so to hear Stan reading about that just now, and how we find our allies, and how we make alliances wherever we might make them. So DEENA was mentioning when we first met, when I first heard of DEENA METZGER, someone handed me an article when I was in graduate school about two women who'd formed a profound friendship. So profound they were young mothers that when they got together trying to write in the middle of their lives, busy lives, they would actually get together to write and then go in separate rooms and write letters to each other. It was DEENA METZGER and Barbara Meyerhoff. Barbara Meyerhoff, the famous filmmaker, documentarian. We lost her 15 years ago, I think. Someone handed me this article in the early 1980s and said, these two people, these two women, they seem to have a friendship that's like the friendship that I see that you have with someone who's you're friends with. And I read this article about these two women and I knew I wasn't in a friendship like that, not yet, but that I had it in me. And that was the beginning of DEENA showing me a path, a way. And I have followed that ever since. It's not so much that I followed what DEENA did, but I followed what I saw was her unending and fierce commitment to a way of making relationships with others and following those where they went. And making a relationship with the creative and following that where it went. And making a relationship with the spirit and following that wherever it takes her. And so our relationship has been one of my sense now, I can't imagine my life without DEENA METZGER. And there are many people on the planet who feel that way. And it's not that she has been a mentor and a teacher, which she has, and anyone who's been gifted with something like that, you just get on your knees, you're so grateful. Because you don't get that every lifetime. But I got it this lifetime. But it has been really her example, as much as our friendship and our beloved love of each other, that has really guided me for so long. And so I hear about this article and I see this possibility, and then my friend Joyce takes me to Sisterhood Bookstore in the West LA. I'm going to school at UCLA. And I see a poster in the bookstore, right? Everyone know the poster?
Yeah.
It's DEENA METZGER, and she has been photographed after having had a mastectomy. And there is a tattoo along the scar of her mastectomy. And Hella Hammond, do I have that name? Hammond. Wonderful photographer, has taken a photograph of her standing out in the, back against the sky of her from the waist up nude. And there's this beautiful tattoo with a branch and a bird, and you look at that, and I've shown it to people who've never seen it before, and I've had people look at me and say, this makes me proud to be a woman. That's an iconic poster. It will outlive DEENA forever. It's been around the world many times. It's been reproduced many times. So I see this poster. I've never met her, but already I'm dazzled. So I go to a reading, and I hear her at the Women's Building in LA, the LA Women's Building. And many people read wonderfully, and she gets up and reads this crazy, wild poetry like nothing I'd ever heard. And I just make a beeline across the room afterwards, and I say, how do I study with you? And she says, there's a 6 months waiting list, but I'll take your name. But they called me in 6 months, and here we all are. So I want to tell you that the path that she's followed has brought her many places. Because she was one of the first women to write so publicly about having breast cancer and doing that poster, she's been involved with the question of healing and the question of how we relate to the medical system for a very, very, very long time. And now she works in an ongoing way with doctors and psychotherapists and healers about how to navigate that system. And at the same time of all of the writing, teaching she's been doing and all the spiritual teaching she's been doing, she has never stopped writing. So DEENA is the author of many novels. Most recently, La Negra y Blanca, which won the 2012 Oakland Pen Award. She's the author of Feral, the book Doors, a fiction for jazz horn, The Other Hand, What DEENA Thought, and several other novels. Her wonderful collection of poems, I think, is back here. Ruin and Beauty, New and Collected Poems, is a lovely connection and retrospective, which includes work from A Sabbath Among the Ruins and Looking for the Faces of God. She wrote a classic book on writing called Writing for Your Life, a guide and companion to the inner worlds. It can keep someone writing for 5 or 6 years. I use it for many, many years. It's a beautiful book. So part of the sample, the example, and the life force that she has shown me all these years is how to be fiercely devoted to your creative muse. And there are a lot of creative people in this room right now. And it's thrilling and wonderful and hard, and it makes you want to tear your hair out. And sometimes you just don't know how you will ever keep doing it. And to know someone who's so devoted and has been so devoted for so long is a great gift that she gives so many of us. So I am thrilled and humbled to welcome my beloved DEENA METZGER.
I want to start with what I wrote for the people who endorsed this book. The world is moving into a shadow of great darkness. Despite these tragic circumstances, there is the light of the undeniable presence of the elementals, the spirits, and the hearts of all those connected to the planet. We are called to so much more than protest. We are called to fundamentally change our thinking, systems, and lives, to divest from all forms and activities that lead to genocide and the ravages of pollution and climate change for humans and non-humans alike. The devastation we call climate change and the barbaric ruins of the Anthropocene began in North America in 1492 with the brutal conquest and colonization. Paradoxically, the Lakota prayer, Metakir Yasin, provides all of us with the essential guidance needed to transform and sustain life. Join us and enter the conversation. So, this book was given. I was coming back from a reading of A Reign of Nightbirds in February 2011. And I was really hungry for the next novel. If I don't have a novel that I'm working on, I'm a really crazy woman. And you know, you finish a book and there's been this long, long relationship with these characters because it takes that long. It's more than 9 months for characters to really come to life. But they do come to life, and then there they are, and now you sort of not really saying goodbye to them, but you know, like grown children, you're asking them to go out in the world and live their own lives. And then there you are, and you've got an empty nest. And so I was leaving the reading, I was driving through Joshua Tree National Park. It's cold, it's winter, and I stopped to take a walk. Walking in Joshua Tree, I found myself preoccupied by picking up garbage until my pockets and hands were full. And yet there was no end to it. I'm sorry. The word surprised me. I had said them aloud. I'm sorry, I repeated. That's when I heard the voice. You know, the voice said, her name is Sandra Birdswell, and she is a meteorologist. The voice spoke with authority. I couldn't dismiss it. Authority and insistence. I had been longing for a novel, and now it was being given to me. So I could not refuse, even though I knew nothing about the character. I had no choice but to accept the challenge that would take me far beyond myself. I did not understand where I was being led, but I had to commit myself and write what was called for. At the moment of this book's inception in Joshua Tree, Terence Green didn't exist either. Then a year later, he came to be. To me, as the writer, Terence Green is a greater mystery than Sandra Birdswell, who introduced him. Once manifest, Sandra determined the story that's being told, and Terence, she revealed, was at the core. At that first moment in Joshua Tree, I didn't know anything about Sandra, except her name and her profession. But what followed from that? Entirely unknown and completely mystifying. I knew less about Terence Green. The process of writing a novel seems simple, but it isn't. Write a character into a story, press save. He or she exists. Highlight his or her name in the surrounding paragraph, press the scissor icon on the toolbar, one or another or both die. then press save to assure their demise. Theoretically, Terence Green can be entirely disappeared from the text. I could paste the words that describe him into a file labeled outtakes, and he would only exist in limbo, waiting to know if he will ever have a real life. That possibility is only theoretical. Sandra appeared, and then Terence appeared. I had great trepidation about writing about him. I didn't know if I have the right to write about a Native man, inasmuch as cultural appropriation is an ongoing violation. But I didn't have the right to refuse him either. Finally, I had to accept what negative consequences might come to me for my limitations and hope to have the skill to record his true self, to honor and respect him as is his due. I had to yield to him. He wanted to live. Sandra insisted, and then he insisted. He asserted that the text cannot exist without him. He carries wisdom. When Terence came forth, Hastine Seda began to speak more forthrightly. He is an elder and certainly a wisdom keeper. The time for this wisdom has come. They will not be erased. It was very early, long before dawn, when light awakened Sandra Birdswell. The broken cloud cover was shimmering with a red glow. It reminded her of the full moon turning red a year and a half before, on August 12, 2003, when proximate to Mars at its perigee to Earth. The radiance was unnerving, as the moon had been then, a blood tide. She propped herself up on pillows and stared out the window, almost eye to eye with the clouds themselves. She waited, listened. Could this shimmer be caused by red waves similar to those she had seen several times in her life as they rose from the imminently vibrating earth before extended earthquakes? But no, everything on the land seemed unmoving. The red persisted. She sensed that deep in space, a flare from the body of the sun was rising up, perhaps already streaming out through the sun's surface towards Earth across the 93 million miles that is the exact distance that makes life possible. She was sure that she wasn't seeing an aurora borealis. Glimmering clouds, perhaps the entire night sky, luminous waves of color, sensation and light had awakened her, were coming in as if beneath the radar. The physical effect of the flare had evoked an analogous attunement to global events that concerned her, a visceral experience of the twist of tornadoes, thunderstorms, cyclones, hurricanes, spinning across land and oceans. A familiar vertigo seized her, not from the motion, but from the alteration of beauty and distress, her gut knowing. She had sensed this since childhood, but lately the sensations were accompanied with grim understanding. These were no mere natural events. The Anthropocene, she thought. We are responsible. I'm reading a kind of collage of one of the themes in the book. Sandra's mother died in childbirth. Her father was a physician, really wonderful country doc. He was there and he lifted the baby out of the mother, put the baby on his chest as the mother died. Before she was born, before he met her mother, he decided could not go to Vietnam, and so he was in the Indian Health Service for 2 years, and there he met Hastine Seda, who was a medicine person, healer. And so Sandra was raised by these two men, really, by her father and by her uncle, Hastine. Visiting Hastine over the years, Sandra had been able to observe him and his friends engage doctoring, an entirely different approach to health and healing than the medical way. Her father's office and the Hogan were her places of learning. She didn't have to choose one over another. Both extended mystery and wonder. But the first time she saw a medicine man extend his hand to scan a patient's body, she felt a shiver of recognition. She wanted to meet the earth the way he approached the man or woman lying on carefully folded blankets on the ground. He moved with quiet attention, deftly tracing every energetic current and flow in the field, both discerning and easing in one gesture with his sure understanding after years of apprenticeship, training, and prayer that the restoration of the patient's body and soul could occur just so. His hand moved like weather does, in waves and eddies, restoring the patterns. Sometimes a hand, sometimes a feather. Common sights took on new meanings. Sometimes she saw that the bird passing overhead, its wings stirring the air, was bringing relief to the earth. As the earth cooled for an instant from the inflammation, the fevers, a world on fire. Sandra paid attention. Hastine's example taught her to be aware of assumptions or judgments. Not knowing what something means, not interpreting, became a habit. If her mind was still, it seemed the non-humans could be heard. As with her father, it was easier to respond this way in Hastine's presence, not easy at home, increasingly more difficult the older she became, the more tense and focused on her studies. But during the crucial years before university, it became second nature to live the analogy between healing mammalian bodies, humans and non-humans, and healing the earth, that body. A murmuration of starlings, the soughing of crow's wings might bring relief. Why not? She did not know about shape-shifting, but longed to become one of those birds. So she's always asked, do you want to be a doctor like your father? And she says, no, I want to be a physician to the earth. And so she goes to graduate school. She starts out, as the voice said originally, in meteorology, but times change. And so by the time she's going through graduate school, she realizes she has to go and study climatology, the larger global sense of what we're in, rather than the daily weather. And Terence Green, who is, as we said, mixed blood, is the chair of the department. The Holy Wind. With these words, Terence Green, chair of the Department of Climatology, opened his introductory lecture. We have come here to study wind. Remember, however, that wind is always invisible and ungraspable. Holy wind, say the original people of this land, in your way you will forget this. again and again. Wind is ungraspable in all meanings of the word. You will think you see it, think you have it pinned, but you won't. Different peoples refer to wind as spirit and breath. The holy wind, the DEENA say. In Hebrew, wind, breath, ruach, spirit. Similar. As atmospheric scientists, as climatologists, you will have to study and understand wind and apply your knowledge and observations to follow its different, most common, and most erratic courses. However, whatever you learn, do not forget that the holy wind is always beyond you. You may see its imprint. You may see evidence of its landing. You may fly into it as a hurricane hunter, spy on it as a tornado chaser. You may think you can measure and predict it, and to accomplish this will be your work. But it will always be beyond you. Buddhists say the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. If only scientists would know that numbers are not the thing in itself. To understand that you will never see and never understand wind is the first step to knowledge. Dr. Terence Green turned on a fan and said, because you can make this wind blow, don't think you can control the forces of nature. Know that trying to control them can do great injury. You may be able to turn the fan on and off, but you aren't able to turn the wind on or off. So, Terence and Sandra, after the right amount of time, you know, she writes her dissertation, she goes on into the world. A certain amount of time, like with a therapist, has passed, and then he's allowed to call her, and they meet, and of course they have an instant connection. They begin to live together very fast, 24 hours. Maybe 36. And they both have houses which they love. She has a house which is circular. It's up on a hill. She can see in every direction. It has a platform above it so she can see even more. It has a weather station. Perfect. He has a house a long house that he built on his own. They're living in a tent. Because, you know, in terms of real life, a house is such a barrier against the world. And they are climatologists because they love the weather and the elementals. So, in the tent. Terence showed her how to build a fire on a sprinkling of tobacco from the materials on the ground. He taught her the fire song. When the fire was hard to start, she sang it, and sometimes it helped. When he sang, the fire started. It wasn't technology, but the singing that made the difference. She had acquired the song, but it wasn't in her yet. Sandra asked Terence, "Is it good to be naked or clothed before the fire?" He said, "It doesn't matter. Fire sees right through you when it burns away all your impediments. To fire, you are a breath that will bring it to light." They were in a tent, not hibernating, but secluded. It was so quiet, she began to feel the global tremors. More and more, she felt tides, and the sun's energy. Sometimes she thought she felt the stretch of the moonrise, its drift across the night sky, and the yoga of setting. The new moon was a ping, like an egg leaving her ovary. She was a stringed instrument the wind played, the earth vibrated in her. What had been intermittent became frequent. She had never had words for these sensations. She had not understood their meanings. If the earth is alive, she began tentatively. Hosteen spoke of the earth in this way. Terence put his hand on the small of her back, gentle, holding her up, listening. Terence's added slightly, almost indiscernible pressure on her back, meeting her exactly, responding to the increase in equally indiscernible tremors, so that his touch continued to be consoling, if imperceptible. Earth's pulse, or the earth's swirl on its axis, or the suction and slide of the magnetic pole shifting, a windstorm, a tornado, a series of multiple sensations, as if she were in weather itself, all of it. He held her, so she let herself sink into the center of it. She was the axis and everything turning around her. But then she was taken by a stab of nausea, followed by dizziness and the fear that the earth was buckling under her. Earthquake, landslide, or tsunami somewhere. These were common enough. Any might be occurring, and so she was perceiving them within her. Or an aerial bombardment, a pipeline exploding, a nuclear plant leaking, drilling, taking out the lifeblood, mining, causing huge abscesses, iridescent pains, knives jabbing in sequence, or the sensation of thorns growing into her flesh, and then fevers taking her, her skin blackening under her soft shirt until she shook with sudden cold. In contact with her, he felt it all as well. His hand burning, then turning to ice. He could not flinch or withdraw. Dread, then woe. Still, as she was willing to experience it all on behalf of the mother, so was he. Alongside the pain, the wonder of the continuity. If the earth is alive, she was going to dare to go further. If earth is alive, if earth is our mother. Sandra's thoughts, jagged and breathless as they were, continued. Sandra was in the space between breaths, where everything is and nothing moves. Or, suddenly, despite or through the pain, it was clear. Earth was alive, and Earth was the mother. Sandra had a mother. She stood up. She stood up straight to contain the quivering that was overtaking her. She had a mother. The mother was alive. Then came the avalanche of bereavement, devastation. She moaned, her eyes rolled back into her head as she shook and wailed, tearing, stabbing, explosive, burning pain, as all the ways the earth was being violated were enacted inside her. The great weight of knowing without being able to mitigate, to save, to change, overwhelmed her. Almost greater than the agony of knowing, of seeing clearly, was the anguish of being helpless. 2007 was a very important year. It was the year of the IPCC report, the International Platform on Climate Change. This international assessment of the reality of climate change is the most important official document of this time. Conservative and compromised as it was, it had been written by contributors from across the globe. It declared climate change as real, the Anthropocene as real. He knew what a courageous step it had been to confirm that the use of fossil fuels is responsible for the dangerous rise of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So when Terence reads this report, it has about 4 sentences in its thousands of pages. And those 4 sentences speak of traditional ecological knowledge, speaks of some indigenous people in Africa who the scientists listened to because they knew something about the climate and how things change and how you meet it. And he's completely undone. And so he takes the report, he realizes that he has to read it on the mountain, on the place where he did ceremony as a child, where his grandfather and his uncle brought him. And now he has to go back to that land, having been in the academic world, and read this report and try to understand what we are in and what he is in. He goes up in the mountain, does ceremony, he prays, and then coming down, he falls. The moment he fell, Terence accepted the blow. He bowed down to receive it. He called it in. He was speaking aloud, though he didn't know to whom he was speaking, or whether he was speaking, or in a dream speaking, or in a spirit realm, to which he had been transported by what appeared to be injury, but was also something else. He was no longer in time or place. There were 1,000 different ways he had accepted that the spirits are real, although Western mind was a miasma of denial that entered through the cracks and fissures of his being like water seeping through, undermining the original structure of all things. He could focus on his body, the pain in his head and his back and hips from the fall. He had fallen and broken, or he had broken and fallen. He could worry about dying, but it seemed irrelevant. The earth was dying. That was the death he was considering. He was a single particle that would survive in one form or another if the universe survived. But the earth? My mother, he said, as if emerging from a war. He was going back through the white mother line to the origin of the bloodletting that had become an incessant flood. He sought the origin of the hemorrhage of the times. He wanted to bleed his mother out of him. He had stood at the snow line that was turning red. He had to do a scan. He had to know before the bleeding stopped. It wasn't injury, it was knowledge. The bleed was memory. He had to taste it in this form. The bleed from his brain that contained his experiences and his ancestors and their experiences encoded outside of language, but translating now into thought, which is the way he knew things. In sharp contrast, the the doctors would inevitably make understanding out of alien figures, chemistries, test results, computations that for them, someone, but not for him, no longer, translated into information. Information is not wisdom, he argued in himself. What could blood tell him, and what did blood want him to know? He had to know if it was a hybrid or a battlefield. From the point he had reached on Mount Hood, he couldn't see the Hanford nuclear reservation that had taken his sacred Rattlesnake Mountain Lalik into its maw. Though it was about 150 miles as the crow flies, he could smell Hanford, the way his people had been trained to smell the death force as it came west over the mountains from across the eastern sea. Not that awareness had enabled them to successfully resist, overcome, or escape. He had turned the entire continent into a marsh. It smelled of sorrow, broken sorrow, salt sorrow, poison sorrow, radiant sorrow, the way that rivers and oceans smell when all the fish die in them at once. Here he was. If he began to think in English, he would be gone. His injuries would deepen. In the English language, he was mortally wounded and had to get to a hospital quickly. Only Western medicine could save him. But if he forbid himself English, its fears and alarms, and entered an indigenous language, even if he had only shards of it or a child's vocabulary, he would gain another understanding. Here he was in the dynamic interchange, in the unceasing world, the ever-present stillness, which was encompassed in the 10,000 years of his almost, but only almost, extinct language. Here he was in his language of deeper knowing. Enabled by his language, a greater agony was coursing through him, melting him into the hidden fire at the molten core of the mountain and into the air around him. Hanford Nuclear Reservation, that abomination, violating the rivers, the poisoned Columbia River, her veins and arteries pumping plutonium, strontium-90, phosphorus 32, zinc 65, arsenic 76, neptunium 239, and sodium 24, radionuclides, radiation into the aquifer, the torque of mutation, blood clotting the streams, seeping into the terrain, his body, the earth, the winds, the fire, and the water, a dynamic yet unmoving exchange, interpenetration. The blood that he tasted was not a tear, but a dissolve. Mind succumbed to heart. Before he spun into unconsciousness, he managed to scrape some earth into his mouth. To stanch the bleeding, he explained to himself. It was dank, sweet, and cold. A poultice that eased his grief. He gave his body up to the dark vultures and carrion eaters who would gather should he die in that spot. He heard the unlikely sound of an owl in daylight, and he blessed whatever his future might be. He blessed Sandra and the mountains. I'm sorry, were his last words before the dark entered like a landslide of ice and snow. So I'd like to end with a short poem. A greater silence. Soon there will be a greater silence than there is now. I do not want to be there alone. When the last tree falls, may I be under it. May the last tree take me down. Thank you.
Any questions? Anyone have a question? Sarojini does.
With California's fires going so strong and so much devastation and suffering, I wondered if, DEENA, if you would offer us some ritual, some action, some internal work we could do, or external that would be of service.
So, yes, so the question is, with California burning, is there some ritual work, ceremonial work, internal work that we can do to meet this moment? Really? That's nice. It's like the prayers in the Senate for the people who were massacred in Las Vegas, but no action came after that. And I know we're all prayerful, and I believe in prayer and all of that, and have devoted my life to it. But when we ask a question like that in these times, I say the only thing that we can do is to completely and absolutely and rigorously change our lives. Because if we pray and then go on continuing and adding to the extinction and the genocide that is going on of the animals and the beings, you can't do that. But you can pray and do ceremony and ritual to help you change your life.
Anyone else?
Well, okay, so how's this? How do you keep from becoming totally depressed and, overcome, I guess, activism?
I'm just going to say one thing, which is when DEENA and I had a podcast recently, we had a conversation and, oh no, actually, sorry, I'm thinking about an incredible interview DEENA did with, remember her name? Anyway, a gifted public radio interviewer. And at one point she said, Mary Elizabeth, she said to DEENA, how can anyone look at what's going on with the planet, the incredible rate of extinction, all that we are losing, and not be in grief 24/7? Another layer of the question that you're asking. And I was very touched by DEENA's answer, which she said, I am in grief 24/7. And I'm here with you, very present, full of joy to be having this conversation. I'm aware of the beauty around me. I'm aware of the love around me and the incredible, sustenance of the earth herself, and that these two things can coexist. And I felt that was a really, really useful answer, because if we've ever all been wondering how are we going to bear it, we're in that place of wondering how we're going to bear it. And the idea that we don't have to choose to be, what did Stan say? Either it's put it away And Zan said, let it go. Well, where does it go? So, either you're looking at it all the time and you're miserable, or you're, numb and forgetful. This idea that there's a way to carry both was a useful path that I heard her speak about. Anyone else want to?
Yeah, there was a gentleman in my class last night, Greg Castro, who's a Selena tribal chair, and for many years, and his brother lost their home in Santa Rosa. And a student asked him, where does all this go? And he said, well, our stories don't always have happy endings. And it's really important to think about that. And he was talking about that no matter what, you still have to keep your dignity and do your best. And he said that for the last 50 years up in that area that's now burning, indigenous people, local elders have been talking to the fire departments and talking to everybody there and saying this is a disaster waiting to happen, just like Nicene Marks is, and nobody does anything. So it's, when the Spanish soldier came here and said this was like a vast, well-tended garden, it was that way because indigenous people did control burns every year. And so you didn't have this kind of thing where you have, 6-foot-tall manzanita, which burns at incredible temperatures and scorches the earth. So the point being, we must have compassion for these people and their laws, but it should be a wake-up call that the knowledge is here. And the people are here to teach this. If only, I don't know what to say, whether it's colonists, I don't know what word to use. If only this world that we're living in here would listen to the world that it feels so righteously about supplanting. Because the Native people are here saying, we want to help, and we have the tools, so please listen. This doesn't have to happen this way.
I think if we really begin to try to fathom what the phrase all my relations really means, a phrase that Native peoples, each in their own language, you have it in yours, Stan, if you would say it.
Shiikayu means with all things I am related. It doesn't mean except for cops, except for Republicans, except for Donald Trump, except for every asshole in the world. It means with all things I am related. It means every animal, plant, stone, every sentient being and what we call non-sentient beings, which is kind of another form of being removed from reality as far as I'm concerned. With all things unrelated, this means that. And it implies the responsibility that, again, includes all of time and space. By that, I mean, there are some people like the Dakotas have this thing about 7 generations. Every decision that you make every day considers the 7 generations that came before you and the 7 generations that come after you. And it's in respect to the sacrifices that the people before you have made so that you can live the way you do now. And you're expected to have an obligation to those people 7 generations down the line that you will never see, who may never, ever, ever know your name. Okay? Shiikayu. Shiikayu.
And if you can take that in, and we will never know what it means because we haven't been saying it for generations. And so it isn't in us in that way. and unfortunately never will be. But to begin to try to fathom what that means, that we are related to everything, means that what happens to another being also happens to us. That's what Sandra is feeling with the earth. But it also means that we are together with everything, which is where the strength comes from, to bear what is going on. So I think the fatigue, the grief that we feel that overwhelms it, that we can't bear it, comes because we're saying, I can't bear it. But when it's not I, when I doesn't exist, when we are suffering, we also know more about how to meet it and how to eliminate the causes of that suffering. So it's a change of mind that we're being called to. And when our minds change, we'll know how to live. And when we know how to live, life may go on.
They say that in the old languages, I've heard this from many of my elders in different nations, that before the coming of the Europeans, in many languages, the word I did not exist.
Wow. Did everyone hear that? He's saying that, just want to repeat that in many indigenous languages, the concept of I does not exist.
The word.
The word.
didn't
So
exist.
that's how deep all my relations goes. So I think we will stop there with these last words from DEENA and Stan. There will be a book signing. Books are available in the back, several of DEENA's classic books, as well as A Reign of Nightbirds, which is, to me, the culmination of her life's work. I'm in love with this book. I urge you to take it home and read it and enjoy it. Blessings upon you. You've been wonderful to be with tonight. Thank you so much.